So on the seventh day, God rested in this beautiful, verdant paradise that he had created. If you remember over the past few weeks, God built this framework, the heavens, the earth, the seas, the dry land, and he filled it with life. So the whole of all of his creation is filled with life, and he came to the end of that process and added image bearers, those who bear his image, those who are known as humanity, humankind. And so in this beautiful setting, at the conclusion of all of this, God rested. And every time we consider the idea of the Sabbath, this is a topic that comes up over and over, we have to return to the garden. We have to go back to that thought and identify the purpose that God rests, the peace of all of creation in which God rests, the temple in which God takes his Sabbath. It's this declaration of the final day of creation, the seventh day, from which the church, from which all of God's people, Israel and God's people, the church, have formed their idea, their theology, and their practice of the Sabbath. The Sabbath in the Ten Commandments starts out as this matter of law. Right? In the Ten Commandments, it becomes this matter of law where God lays down, this is what it will be. And he says this, remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Okay, so now he's given a framework for how to understand this. He says, 6 days you shall labor and do your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So God has fashioned something here out of that declaration of the seventh day of creation. He rests, and then in giving his law and giving the boundaries by which his people Israel would have relationship with him, he says, this is something that you are to set aside. This is something that you are to set aside in the same way that God set this day aside. He rested. And when God rested in the temple that he had created, God is now telling his people Israel, on that day, it will be all about me. In the way that you saw me rest in the temple, you will now come to the temple and you will have your rest. You will have the relationship with me. You will have this communion with me. In this perfection that I have created, in the beauty that I have created. And God blessed that and made it holy. So here it is. That's the law. This is going to be the nature of our relationship. Now it's interesting that Rick had brought up legalism because this is where things begin to take a turn. This is where things begin to change the way we understand Sabbath. When God codifies this and puts it on these tablets, Israel says, okay, these are the rules. And so if we can somehow stay within the rules, everything will be cool. God will be pleased with us, we'll be blessed, everything will be wonderful. Now, that is not the intention of the Ten Commandments, but that's how people interpreted it. And as we know, God's people Israel take the Ten Commandments and expand them and expand them and expand them, adding. In fact, when it comes to the Sabbath, God's people Israel were expert at figuring out ways in which they could honor this by not honoring it. What defines work? Well, if I go 49 steps, but not 50, I haven't worked yet. If this happens and it's cloudy, I'm exaggerating a bit, but this is what they had done. They had taken the purity of what God said, but not the intention. They had taken the purity of what God said. They had taken it at face value, word for word, and said, okay, how can we build a framework where we can still do what we want to do and still remain in the good graces of God? So that's the legalistic interpretation that had been set for God's people Israel, and it's going to become the legalistic interpretation of the church. The church has, by and large, interpreted the Sabbath legalistically. Like it is a day, we name it as this day, the first day of the week, and on that day, you are to do no labor. Now, depending on which tribe of the faith you come from, some are more or less applied or less reined in by that legalistic understanding of things. When Jesus is confronted with this legalistic understanding, he corrects it. He challenges it, and yet people still don't get it. In Mark chapter 2 and 3, we have this series of controversies between the Jewish leadership and the Messiah. Jesus is doing things according to God's will. He is acting in perfect accord with the Ten Commandments because he wrote the Ten Commandments. He is acting in perfect accord with it, and at every step, he bumps up against the legalism of the Pharisees. Their hair is on fire because of the things that he's doing. He has forgiven sins. Oh no. Who would have thought that God himself could forgive sins? Now, of course, they don't understand that. They can't see it clearly. And then he does this, and then he does this. And at every step, he's running into controversy with this group. And they're challenging him, and they're beginning to see him as this heresy for breaking all these rules. He calls Levi. Why are you hanging out with a sinner? Why are you doing this? Jesus says, you guys don't get it. There's this little passage, Mark chapter 2, 23 to 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisee said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" All right, all he's done, and they walk through the field, is comb his fingers through the grain and taken some kernels to eat. But they, in their framework of rules, have said, well, that's work. And Jesus said, no, I'm just eating. We're just walking through. So maybe they went too many steps. Maybe they made too many kernels. Whatever it was, they violated this legal framework that Israel had constructed, and they were therefore now sinners. They were breaking the Sabbath. Jesus calls them to remember. Have you never read what David did when his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Now that should have shut him up. They should have said, well, yeah, okay, this has happened before, never mind. But they don't. They double down. They push down on him. And when they do so, Jesus corrects their understanding of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was not given as a regulation. The Sabbath was not given as a legal framework for what to do or not to do on whatever the Sabbath day is during the week. The Sabbath was given for something else altogether. Jesus concludes that little passage. He says this, then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Now, he said something perfectly clear to us, because we've read the whole story, but something that is a complete mystery to the Pharisees, because they are stuck in their legalism. They are stuck in their legalistic framework, and they have very little capacity to go outside of that and begin to consider things in any other fashion. They cannot think things through. All they can do is follow the rules, and this is what creates the biggest separation between them and God. God gives them something for good, and they turn it into a way to get around things. They turn it into something to be challenged. They turn it into something that helps them live their own lives while remaining in God's blessing. So the day of rest, the Sabbath day that God creates on the seventh day, is not for God's benefit. It is for the benefit of humankind. It is especially good for his image bearers in creation, in the midst of all that he has made for them and all that he has called them to do. The Sabbath day is set aside as a day on which those image bearers could put the whole of their attention on God, that they could devote the entirety of all of their thought, energy, exercise, everything on God. That was the purpose of God resting. That was the purpose of the creation of the Sabbath. God did not create it as a ritual observant. Like we get our calendar out and we say, okay, this day, I can only do this, and this can only happen, and everything else. God never intended for it to be done that way. God never intended to be life lived that way, but this is where it's come to, and this is where we often interpret the Sabbath as a rule, something we have to follow. If we want to stay in God's good graces, we have to follow the Sabbath. We have to follow the rules for the Sabbath, and we become a lot like Israel. And that's never the way that God intended for this to be. So let's turn to Genesis chapter 2, where we're going to read the end of the creation narrative. As we turn to that seventh day of creation, we have two storylines that are going to play out in front of us. This beauty and grandeur of all of creation, of all that God has made, and all that he said is very good. And we're going to see the special place of the image bearers in the midst of this garden. So at this point, we notice that we remember that God is on the outside of creation, right? God is looking down, looking up, however he's doing it. God is saying, let this be, let this be, let this be, let this be. But he is an external actor. The entirety of the Godhead sits external from creation. And that's important to remember, because something's going to change here on the seventh day that changes the entirety of creation. So we keep these things in front of us, and then we watch what happens. Now, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2 really belong at the end of chapter 1. So we're not starting a new topic. This is just a continuation and the way that the Bible's gotten broken up. So chapter 2, verse 1, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And that is the conclusion of the creation narrative. But it is a monumental change in the way things are going to be. The heavens and the earth are complete. 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 It needs nothing. It is not missing anything. There is nothing else to come. There's nothing else that will someday be needed. God has said at the end of all that he created, the way he created it, the manner in which he created it, he says, I'm done. It's complete. It is finished. And once it is finished, there is no further creation to happen. There is nothing more to happen. And I think we want to wrap our minds around that, because so much of what the world says is that everything's in this constant turmoil. Everything's changing. Words mean something different this year. People change. The whole of history is going to change. But when God was done creating, he said, I'm finished. I'm finished. It's over. What you have in front of you is it, until I do something different. God did not create this kind of sandbox playground where things might go this way and this might happen and that might happen over the course of history. God didn't create it that way. He says, it's done. It's done. This is the way things are to be. And this includes all the laws of motion and gravity and all these things that we take for granted. It's done. Now, we may discover parts of it as history goes along, but we're not going to change it. We're not going to create a different outcome. There are not 5 different paths at the end of history where one of them might come true. I'm done. All right, so God says it is complete, and that means it is perfect. God created it exactly the way that he wanted it to be. He created humankind, male and female, exactly the way that he wanted it to be. He laid out all the animals and plants and everything else exactly the way that he wanted it to be. And he said, I'm done. I'm done. I'm finished. And keep that in mind, because that tells us what the second verse says. By the 7th day, God had finished. He had completed the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested. Now that's the word Sabbath. That's where we're going to draw Sabbath out of. It does not mean rest like God got into his giant Barcalounger and kicked his feet up. What it means is that God stopped working. That's what Sabbath means. He ceased to work, meaning I'm done. I'm done. This is exactly what I would create, and it is finished. So God ceases working from all his work. God is not tired. God is not exhausted. God is not wiping his brow and saying, whew, man, that was tough. 6 days, man. Okay, now I'm ready. No, God stops working. It is perfect. It is complete. God is finished. He has created something out of nothing. He has filled it with all manner of life. He has placed his image bearers in there. He has given them their role and their purpose and their identity. And he says, now it's done. That is the definition of perfection. This is what I intended for this to be. I'm done. Okay, so when it says God rested, he's not resting. He's not laying his head down. He is stopping to work. And then in verse 3, this is what makes this day special. God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he ceased from all the work of creating. He rested from all the work of creating that he had done. God blessed the 7th day. God made it holy. And what we're seeing, if we were more Jewish in our faith, we would see this immediately, is that God has created the temple. God has created this blessed, holy place in which he can now dwell in the midst of creation with his image bearers. So when God rested, when he ceased working, he now is going to take up dwelling in the perfection and the beauty and the majesty and the grandeur and all the other adjectives that he has created here. And he's going to dwell with his image bearers. And they will have perfect communion with him. And the order of things will be, we're going to set aside a time in which you'll be done working, you'll be done with your stewardship role. You'll have a day in which you will do nothing but worship me. And how do we know that? Because he's blessed it and he's made it holy. It is a day set aside for that perfect communion to be exercised. It is a day where everything else will cease and God will be worshiped in his temple. And we see the perfection of all of this when we see the tabernacle and then later the permanent temple come into being. And we look at the beauty of those structures and yet how ugly they are, because God's way over here in this little part of the tent, right? Or he's way over here in this little tiny part of the temple. And then there's this little bigger part where some people can go, right? And then there's another court where some more people can go. And then there's this outer court where us would go. And then there's not even in the temple, right? It's this gradual, closer, closer, closer. There's none of that. In the perfection of creation, God dwells in this perfect communion with his image bearers. His image bearers have this perfect communion with him. We'll see that God will speak directly to them. They will recognize his presence. Everything will be perfect. The animals will all get along. They'll be like little bunnies hopping everywhere. Ripe fruit on the trees 365 days a year. It's just going to be beautiful and glorious. And that's the Sabbath as God defines it. It's this perfect communion, this perfect day of worship. And so when God gives the 10 Commandments, he says, set aside a day, don't work, you're done. You've done enough. You finish working, cease working, and spend this day with me. Spend this day communing with me. Enjoy the blessings of me being your God. No, we want rules. We need rules. We need to have structure. And of course, that carries on all through God's people, Israel, into when Jesus comes, and Jesus bumps right up against it. And they're saying, dude, what are you doing? You cannot pick grain on the Sabbath. Jesus says the Sabbath is made for humankind. The Sabbath, you weren't made for the Sabbath. You weren't made to limit yourself on the Sabbath. You were made to have this day of worship. And even today, this idea of a day of Sabbath, a legal structure of Sabbath, has continued. And this is what we run into. So what should the Sabbath mean to us? If we think about it for each of ourselves, what should it mean? Like a lot of things in the Old Testament, we look at the idea of the Sabbath, we look at the commandment for the Sabbath, and we say, is this something that we have to keep? We as Christians are not God's people, Israel, so is this something that we have to keep? Do we have to keep the Sabbath? And the answer, this might not satisfy you, but the answer is this. If you and I need to be reminded or commanded or pushed into observing the Sabbath, then it doesn't serve its function, right? So if I have to tell you, okay, you got a Sabbath, and here's the rules, and here's what you can do. Well, then the thread has been broken. It doesn't serve the function of you wanting and desiring and giving yourself over to communion with God. The Sabbath is not the sort of thing that is to be governed by rules and regulations. The Sabbath is given so that we can acknowledge the Creator God, that He is on the throne, that He is in His perfect temple right now, that this world is His world, that our time, the life that we have, is His gift to us, and out of that gift, we separate off a part of it and we devote it to the worship of God. And so when we ask questions like, do I have to? Okay, I mean, do I have to think, like this? Do I have to practice the Sabbath? Do I have to do this? Can I eat shellfish? Can I wear something of mixed fabrics? We've lost the whole idea of why all these things were given, and this applies to the 10 Commandments for it. Do I have to do this? Do I have to do this? Listen, if we have to ask questions like that, we've lost the whole idea of the relationship with God. I'll give you this really short illustration. So I want you to think of the most important person to you in your world. Your spouse, your kids, whoever it is. All right, you got that person in your mind? All right, you love that person. You adore that person. You tell that person, I would do anything I would die for you. Right? You with me? Okay. So you look that person in the eyes. Just little birds, little hearts and everything. If you got the picture, okay. You say, person, I love you. I love you so much. My whole life is given to you. I'm fully devoted to you. This person's this huge smile. And you say, now are you going to expect me to remember your birthday every year? Why are you laughing? I mean, am I going to have to do something for our anniversary every year? Do I have to remember your birthday? Do I have to remember, your graduation? You laugh, but that's what we do to God when we ask whether or not we have to keep the Sabbath. We sang, God, we love you, we praise you, we honor you, we give our lives to you. But really, do I have to worship you too? I mean, what are the rules here? See, when we start asking, what are the rules here? What is the structure here? What are the regulations here? Well, you wouldn't do that to your spouse, to your kids, to your whoever came into your mind as the most important person in your mind. You wouldn't do that to that person. Why in the world would we do that to the Creator God who has redeemed us, saved us, called us out, made us His own? And we laughed, and that's good, but that's what we do about things like the Sabbath. Really, do I have to honor the Sabbath? Well, it depends what you mean by honoring the Sabbath. If you have a set of rules for what it means to honor the Sabbath, then you've lost the wrong idea. But if you mean by honoring the Sabbath that I fully devote myself to worshiping God, I give myself time to commune in His presence, to be in His holiness, to examine my own holiness so I can ensure that I can be near Him, that I can be around God's people. If that's what you mean by communion with God, then that's what the Sabbath is created for. It's created for relationship. It is created for the depth of our faith. As Christians, we've talked about this a number of times, but we are not a people that should need a lot of rules. Our rules are simple. We have our identity in Christ. We have His Holy Spirit dwelling within us. we know the story and where it's headed in the future, we should be able, through that triangle of things, be able to govern our lives in a way that honors God. When we don't, one of those 3 points will get out of whack, and we should sense it. And that same thing applies here. I give you no regulation about the Sabbath. I give you what the Sabbath was created for, why God did what he did. He dwells in his temple to be worshiped by his people. He gives us this fellowship so we can gather with other believers and in this corporate voice raise praises to him. It is so that we can support one another, so that we can be accountable to one another, so that we can be watchkeepers over one another's lives to ensure that those points of reference in our faith, we're not getting out of whack on one of those. That's the purpose for all of that. Bless you, that's the purpose of this Sabbath. So I guess going back to the question, do we have to keep this Sabbath? Do we have to honor this Sabbath? I'll answer this way. Why wouldn't we devote ourselves to any opportunity to worship God? There you go. I answered a question with a question. I know you're not supposed to do that, but we did. So when we come to the end of creation, come to this 7 days being finished, this whole narrative comes to a close, we should come to this perspective of our incredibly privileged position. We bear the image of God. He is settled in his temple. We have this perfect communion with him. As his image bearers, as icons, we have been placed in the temple, right? We're not outside. We're not excluded by any kind of wall. We are directly in God's temple, in his presence. We are given the privilege of stewardship. We are given all the tools that we need to bear his glory, to show his glory to one another, to show his glory to him. We have everything we need. And so he gives us this day. He names this day as holy. He says, this is a day when you can set aside everything else and spend it with me. And I'll see your glory. You'll see each other's glory. All of creation will be blessed by the presence of the glory bearers. And a lot's happened from that time to today, but we still have the same blessed opportunity. You still bear the image of God. You still have his glory. You can still show that glory to one another. You can show that glory to the world. And on this day, this is when we have decided to gather. At this hour, we come together, same spirit, of one mind, to worship God in this holy place, to be in his presence, to have his spirit move, to celebrate the redemption of the cross of Christ, to look at our lives today, the now and not yet, and to glory in the promised future that we have ahead. Amen? Amen. Let's stand.